Hi, everyone. And depending on where you're tuning in, good morning or good afternoon. I'm Roger Zakheim, Director of the Reagan Institute. We are the home of the Reagan Foundation in the nation's capital. A couple of months ago, I had the honor of hosting Secretary of State Pompeo, who joined us when we came together to launch the Reagan Institute's new Center for Freedom and Democracy. Its mission is to restore President Reagan's optimistic, confident approach to promoting freedom, democracy, and human dignity, both at home and abroad. Today, we're pleased to welcome to the Reagan Institute one of the strongest advocates for such a foreign policy and a member of our center's Westminster 2.0 working group, the chair of the House Republican Conference, Representative Liz Cheney. In a profile of her published in November, one of Congresswoman Cheney's colleagues was quoted as saying, "She kind of reminds you of Margaret Thatcher." Here at the Reagan Institute, that's extraordinarily high praise. And if these past few months have proven anything, it's that Congresswoman Cheney certainly has the resolve, fortitude, and conviction of a 21st century Iron Lady. Now, as I mentioned when Senator Cotton took the same stage last week, in 2021, we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of our 40th president's inaugural year. During this 40 at 40 year-long celebration, we're commemorating major events from the Reagan presidency in 1981. This week, we're marking President Reagan's first state dinner, where, as it happens, he hosted British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Now, I wish we could claim we planned it all the way, but Congresswoman Cheney was originally scheduled to join us in November, so we're not quite as clever as we look. Now, in the toast that evening, President Reagan said, quote, "In these days, the survival of our nations and the peace of the world are threatened by forces which are willing to exact any pressure, test any will, and destroy any freedom. Survival in this era requires us, as those who preceded us, to take freedom in the palm of our hands and never to cower behind a veil of unrealistic optimism. We shall learn from those who spoke of the need for vigilance, even when speaking out was not popular," end quote. Congresswoman Cheney is known for the same clear-eyed approach to foreign policy. She can be counted on to speak out even when it is not popular. As a former State Department official, she understands the realities of diplomacy and foreign affairs like few of her colleagues. So today, we are honored to welcome her as she offers her thoughts on building a 21st century foreign policy. No doubt, her remarks will echo the need for the same timeless principles in defense of freedom today that President Reagan evoked that February evening 40 years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, Representative Liz Cheney of Wyoming.
Well, thank you very much, Roger. It's wonderful to be with you. Thanks so much to the Reagan Institute for hosting me today. It's a particular honor to be able to discuss the challenges that we face, to do it here at the Institute that's named for one of our greatest Republican presidents. So thank you very much for that. And following on, laying things out in terms of Ronald Reagan's view of the world and Ronald Reagan quotes, there's one that was part of a speech that he gave in 1983, talking about defense spending. And he described then the duty and the choice facing all of us as stewards of liberty. He said, "It is up to us in our time to choose and choose wisely between the hard but necessary task of preserving peace and freedom and the temptation to ignore our duty and blindly hope for the best while the enemies of freedom grow stronger day by day." That's the choice for each generation, and it is certainly a choice we must make today. From China to Russia to Iran to North Korea, America's adversaries are on the march, and the world is confronting a global pandemic that's taken the lives of 2.5 million people, including 500,000 Americans. Though the threats that we face have changed and grown in complexity in many ways since Reagan's time, I would say that there are some fundamental truths that must guide us as a nation in defending ourselves, our allies, and our interests. The first of these is that America is the exceptional nation. We've guaranteed freedom, security, and peace for more people across the globe than has any other nation in all of history. There is no other like us, and there never has been. No other nation, international body, or community of nations can do what America has done. We have led the world because it is right, because it is necessary, and because our security, our prosperity, and our freedom depend upon it. This duty comes at a tremendous cost, but the cost of inaction is much higher. Imagine a world where the rules are set not by America and the allies of freedom, but instead by Russia, Iran, or China. Imagine a world ruled by the Chinese Communist Party's surveillance state technology. Imagine a Europe controlled by Putin, free nations enslaved. Imagine a world where Islamic terrorists expand their safe havens and spread their ideology unchallenged across the globe. Some in both parties today choose to ignore these threats or to blame America. They suggest that if America would simply retreat, the threats would diminish. Such an assertion requires a willful disregard of history and of truth. And these ideas are just as dangerous today as they were in 1940, when isolationists launched the America First movement to appease Hitler and prevent America from aiding Britain in the fight against the Nazis. Isolationism was wrong and dangerous then, and it is wrong and dangerous now. As we confront the challenges facing our nation, we must remember another fundamental truth, and that is that weakness is provocative. Reagan understood, quote, war comes not when the forces of freedom are strong. It is when they are weak that tyrants are tempted. Preserving peace and freedom requires that our adversaries and our allies know we have the will and the means to defend ourselves and our interests. This means we must fund defense of the nation, and we must do so at levels sufficient to maintain or regain our superiority. A flat or reduced defense budget will force our military to make unwise, inefficient, and risky cuts, even as the threats that we face grow. While America falls behind, Russia and China will continue pouring funds into their military buildup and their modernization efforts. We have already seen reports that President Biden is considering cuts to nuclear modernization, despite the reality that China's nuclear weapons stockpile may quadruple over the next decade, and Russia is aggressively modernizing each leg of its triad. Every year that we delay modernizing our nuclear triad, U.S. deterrence grows less and less effective, flexible, and credible. Our triad is decades old. Investments in modernization, which make up a small fraction of the DoD budget, are integral to our nation's security. America and her allies simply cannot afford further cuts or delays to our aging warheads and delivery systems, including and especially to the land-based leg of our triad. Any such cuts would amount to unilateral disarmament. Similarly, adopting any policy that restricts the United States' ability to defend ourselves, such as the no first use policy with respect to our nuclear forces, severely undermines our deterrent and makes the world far more dangerous. Multiple successive STRATCOM commanders and secretaries of defense from both political parties have urged against the adoption of such a policy. Our allies have opposed a no first use policy, in part because it would cripple America's nuclear umbrella. This nuclear umbrella has upheld peace and security for decades. The United States should never adopt policies that restrain our exercise of power while our adversaries do the opposite. Nor should we ever adopt policies of appeasement. Some of the opening moves of the Biden administration with respect to Iran, China, and Russia suggest that they haven't fully learned this lesson. The Iranian nuclear deal remains the single worst agreement the United States has ever entered into. We were right to withdraw and turn to a policy of maximum pressure with sanctions against the regime. Any effort by the Biden administration to return to the deal would be a mistake and would signal to Iran that nuclear blackmail is effective. A return to this deal would also put Israel, America's strongest ally in the Middle East, under increased threat. A strong U.S.-Israel relationship is at the heart of our security across the Middle East, and it is a prerequisite for our security. America must always stand unequivocally against efforts to delegitimize the state of Israel. We must oppose the anti-Semitic BDS movement. We must not tolerate anti-Semitism or Holocaust denial in any form or forum. Words matter. We must never forget, and our actions must always demonstrate our commitment to the State of Israel. One of our great strengths as a nation is our energy independence, both domestically and with respect to our national security. The executive orders issued in President Biden's first days in office banning new oil and gas leasing on federal lands are deeply misguided, and they threaten to turn back the clock to the days when we were dependent on foreign sources of energy. Though we face new challenges and threats, including the threat of growing security risks from Russia and China, we must continue to defend our nation from radical Islamic terrorism. This means we must have sufficient forces deployed in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, to conduct counterintelligence and counterterrorism operations and deny terrorist safe havens from which they could launch attacks against the United States. Decisions about troop levels must always be made based on conditions on the ground. Political timetables set in Washington are dangerous and irresponsible. Working with NATO, we must also hold Russia to account. Instead of extending the New START treaty for 5 years, as Putin wanted, the Biden administration should have insisted on a renegotiated treaty that included China and expanded the scope of weapon systems it covered. The Biden administration should impose sanctions against the Kremlin for Russia's use of chemical weapons against Alexei Navalny and its perpetration of the SolarWinds hack. Putin has demonstrated a determination to dominate Europe and weaken NATO, and we must not let that happen. We must fully enforce the sanctions against the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and stand with our allies in Europe to sanction Russian officials who perpetuate Putin's regime of tyranny and abuse. One of the greatest threats our nation faces today is the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP is conducting multiple offensive campaigns against the United States across nearly every domain, from space to cyberspace to commercial, industrial, military. Last year, in the wake of the global pandemic unleashed from China, the House Republicans produced a task force report focused on what we must do to stop China and defend ourselves. 2/3 of the proposals of the report are bipartisan. An important first step for the Biden administration would be to adopt many of the report's proposals, to begin to defend our supply chains, our data, our interests, our allies, and our own security. We should come together in a bipartisan fashion to be clear-eyed in confronting the threat China poses. And we must recognize their determination to dominate the globe with their surveillance state technology. We will not let that happen. Our strength in the United States comes from our power. It also comes from the power of our ideas and our ideals, the power of our freedom. And this brings me to January 6th. In his first inaugural address, Ronald Reagan said this: "The orderly transfer of authority, as called for in the Constitution, routinely takes place as it has for almost 2 centuries. And few of us stop to think how unique we really are. In the eyes of many in the world, this every 4-year ceremony that we accept as normal is nothing less than a miracle." What we saw firsthand on January 6th was a threat to this system, a threat and the fragility of our system. I've worked in my career in many countries around the world where they do not have peaceful transfers of power, where violence determines who rules. That almost happened here in the United States on January 6th. 5 people died, hundreds were injured. What happened on that day must never happen again, and we must not look away or trivialize it. The security of our nation, the defense of our freedom, and America's ability to continue to lead the world all demand that those of us who are elected and appointed officials conduct ourselves in ways that are worthy of the sacrifice so many have made in generations past for our freedom. The freedom that others have fought and died for must not be squandered. Attacks on it, such as the one we saw on January 6th, must not be minimized. The freedom that we all defend belongs not to us. It belongs to our children and our grandchildren. To them, we owe fidelity to the Constitution and a duty to uphold our oath, an oath we swore under God to do everything necessary to defend it. That is, at its core, the great strength of this, the greatest nation on earth. We have guided and led the world in the triumph of freedom since World War II. Those of us who care deeply about our history and our future, who take our oaths and our obligations seriously, will steer our party and our nation into the future. We will right the unforgivable wrongs of January 6th. We will make our party worthy once again of the mantle of Lincoln and Reagan. And we will ensure that the forces of freedom prevail in the decades to come. Thank you very much, Roger, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Congresswoman Cheney, thank you so much for those comprehensive set of remarks. I'll have a bunch of questions, conversation with you for next 10, 15 minutes or so, and then we'll have some questions from our viewers. Let's start with the new administration. You hit on early concerns you have vis-a-vis Iran, China, Russia, some of the executive orders. As you know, President Biden recently addressed the Munich Security Conference, first real comprehensive set of remarks from him on foreign policy. He said, quote, "America is back. So let's get together and demonstrate to our great-grandchildren when they read about us that democracy functions and works, and together there is nothing we can't do." America's back seems to be that theme focusing on democracy. Do you agree with that outlook? And when he says America is back, what should that mean and what should that not mean?
Well, look, I think it's very important for us, as I laid out in my remarks, to recognize that America, is the one indispensable nation, that America has to lead, and that there are multiple aspects to our leadership. One of them, which we saw very clearly in the past administration, was a commitment to providing the resources necessary for the Department of Defense and for the defense of the nation. And so I hope that we see President Biden continue that commitment. I hope we see a recognition on the part of the Biden administration that fundamental to preserving the peace is making sure that we have the resources we need to protect ourselves from all threats, making sure our adversaries know that. I do think that it's very important for us not to confuse American leadership in the world with America re-entering into agreements that we know are damaging. And two in particular are the Paris Climate Accords and the Iranian nuclear deal. I think that American leadership has to mean that we're leading in ways that serve our interest and in ways that defend and protect security and freedom. The Iranian nuclear deal certainly doesn't do either of those things. It makes the world less safe, not more safe. And the Paris Climate Accord imposes costs on the United States, costs on our economy, costs on employment, on jobs, while not imposing any costs on countries like China, for example, and not accomplishing or moving even, the ball down the field at all towards whatever objectives and goals the administration's laid out with respect to climate change. So I think America must lead. I think that there are a number of instances, unfortunately, that we've seen in the first few weeks of this administration that have not matched that rhetoric, which is unfortunate because I think it's crucial for our safety.
And I want to get to some of those specifics you just went through, Iranian nuclear deal, Paris climate change. But one of the things that really came out from President Biden's remarks is this challenge between autocracies and democracies. And he said that we're at this inflection point for democracies around the world, and that we must demonstrate that democracies can still deliver for our people in this changed world. He said that's the, quote, galvanizing mission. You spoke a lot about freedom and democracy and America's role in leading that in the world. Do you agree with that assessment that that should be our galvanizing mission, and that we're at this inflection point?
I agree with that. I think it's very important for us to recognize that the free nations of the world have to work together. We have to work with alliances, and we have to be willing to stand up and defend freedom, to stand up and defend democracy, and to understand the threat that we face today, in particular from autocratic regimes like China and like Russia. And I know I've heard, as I'm sure many on this call have, over the course of several years from people around the world who say things like, well, gosh, democracy is messy. And it's a lot easier sometimes to deal with autocrats. And I do think we have to return to explaining and defending and building the kind of alliances that you all are doing with the Westminster Group, some of the parliamentary alliances and working groups that we have and that we've formed that really do remind people both of the morality of democracy and of the fragility of these systems, but of ultimately, the resilience of them, and that ultimately it is the ideals of freedom that will prevail, but it won't be by accident. It'll be because those of us who live in free countries defend that freedom both at home and abroad.
And your remarks really hit on the point that to effectively lead in the world, we need to speak honestly and openly about what happened at home on January 6th. So let's delve into that for a couple of minutes. This talk is fundamentally focused on foreign policy, but this is a key thread. You've been outspoken that January 6th was an insurrection. It was assault on our democracy. Your remarks with us just now reinforce that again. You voted to impeach President Trump. What is the state of our democracy at home? What do you say to critics of the United States that seek to advance democracy and freedom in the world when they say what you've just captured, that we have this fragility in the system and we have had this trauma that recently took place?
Well, I say, first of all, on January 6th, our institutions held. It was very important that we in the House and our colleagues in the Senate were able to return to our chambers, were able to continue and to complete the counting of the electoral votes, and not allow the violent mob to stop that or to delay it. And so the institutions held. But it also was a reminder of how close they came to not holding, and how, we, as we look at what's necessary to protect and defend our system, it really is incumbent upon those of us who are elected officials. It's incumbent upon those who incumbent upon everybody who takes an oath of office and swears to protect and defend the Constitution. That we recognize what happened on January 6th, that we commit ourselves that it must never happen again, that we recognize the damage that was done by the president, President Trump, saying that somehow the election was stolen, making those claims for months, and summoning the mob and provoking them then in the attack on the Capitol. And also, and very importantly, in refusing, despite multiple requests from people to ask him to stop what was happening, to ask him to stop the violence, to protect the Capitol, to protect the counting of electoral votes, he didn't do so. And I think that one of the most important things that we need to demonstrate to the world, but more importantly, that we need to make sure that we do to protect our system and to protect our republic, is to be clear that is behavior that is absolutely unacceptable behavior. It's dangerous. It's an existential threat to who we are, and it can't be minimized or trivialized, and it can never happen again.
Yeah, and those were words you used in your remarks, that we should not trivialize, we should not minimize. Obviously, by speaking out and addressing the issue like you've done today is one way not to trivialize and not to minimize it. Is there anything else that you think we as a country ought to do, the Congress ought to do, the conference in which you're chair of ought to do to make sure we're not trivializing or minimizing or is exhausted by what we're doing here today, what you're speaking about?
No, I think that it's a good question, Roger. I think there are many things. I think, first of all, certainly the potential of a 9/11 style commission. I think that's very important. I think there are many aspects to what happened on the 6th and in the days, weeks, and months leading up to it that have to be investigated. And I think having a commission with the formality that we saw in the 9/11 commission, with the bipartisan participation that we saw in the 9/11 commission, that's very important. A commission with subpoena power, a commission that really is able, and I think it should have retired officials on it. I don't think you should have current officials on the commission. I really think the model that was used in the aftermath of 9/11 is a good one. So I think that's important. I think there will be criminal investigations that are going on and that will be ongoing. But I think while those things are happening, it's very important for us to ignore the temptation to look away. And it's very important, especially for us as Republicans, to make clear that we aren't the party of white supremacy. You certainly saw anti-Semitism. You saw the symbols of Holocaust denial, for example, at the Capitol that day. You saw a Confederate flag being carried through the rotunda. And I think we as Republicans in particular have a duty and an obligation to stand against that, to stand against insurrection, and to be clear that for us to fight, what Margaret Thatcher called very aptly the quicksand of socialism, which we are facing from the left, for us to fight that effectively, the Constitution has got to be our shield. And we have to defend the Constitution because we know that, frankly, there are too many on the other side who won't. And because that's our best and most effective tool to stand against the infringements on First Amendment rights and Second Amendment rights and the massive expansion of the role of the federal government in our lives. And if we don't uphold the Constitution, we cannot defend against the real threat that we're facing from the left either.
I'm going to move on in a moment to the kind of other subjects within the foreign policy discussion, but one more on what you've just addressed in response to January 6th. You mentioned a 9/11-like commission and with the emphasis on it being bipartisan or having those bipartisan features. Are you optimistic that something like that will go through Congress and be adopted? Is that something underway or not as mature quite yet?
I hope that it will be. I know that there are discussions underway. I think you've seen some of the initial proposals that have come out from Speaker Pelosi. I think her initial proposal, which is to have a 7-4 Democrat-Republican split, is unacceptable. I think it's very important. We're facing in many ways a crisis of confidence in our institutions and in our electoral process. And I think that the 9/11 type commission could play a very important role in helping citizens across the country understand and recognize what happened. But it needs to really be bipartisan and really be populated with serious individuals who will take a clear-eyed look at what went on. And I think that also has to include what went on in terms of questioning the outcome of the election and the extent to which, there really was the president and many around him pushed this idea that the election had been stolen. And that is a dangerous claim. It wasn't true. There were, over 60 court cases where judges, including judges appointed by President Trump and other Republican presidents, looked at the evidence in many cases and said there is not widespread fraud and wouldn't grant the relief that the Trump campaign was seeking. So the idea that we in Congress were going to step in and somehow overturn the results of the election on January 6th was never true, was unconstitutional, was wrong. And I think that for facing the facts about what happened in the election. I hope that's something that can come partly from the 9/11 Commission. I think our media plays a huge role in that. I think that, any media organization that was perpetuating the notion continues to perpetuate the notion that the election was fraudulent or was stolen, is contributing to a very dangerous set of circumstances. And I think the American people need to know the truth about what happened.
So let's go back deeper into the Trump administration prior to January 6th. And there were a number of issues on foreign policy where you supported the Trump administration, others where you were less supportive. You hit on a couple of them today, defense spending, for example. But what would you say we've learned over the 4 years of Trump presidency in terms of foreign policy? And most importantly, what should stay?
Well, I think you've pointed to one of the most important pieces, and that was the commitment, the dedication to providing resources necessary to help our military dig out of the hole, help the Defense Department dig out of the hole that we were in after 8 years of the Obama administration. I think also providing resources, in particular for nuclear modernization, was very important. I think the decision, for example, to pull out of the INF treaty was important. I think looking at and recognizing the threat that China poses and being willing to address that threat. I think you can point to a lot of things that happened during the Trump administration on national security policy that were good and beneficial for the country. And I would hope that many of those won't just be rejected by the Biden administration, for partisan reasons. I think that it's very important that we're now moving towards a reinvigorated relationship with NATO. I think NATO is the single most effective and successful alliance probably in history, and it's one that we need to ensure that we are strongly and proudly part of as we work to confront the threats to freedom and the challenges posed particularly by Putin. So
let's drill down on one of those. Generally supportive of Trump administration China policy. You referenced the House Republican China task force. President Biden came out and has kind of departed in some ways from certainly the rhetoric and approach of the previous administration when it comes to China. Specifically, he said at the Munich Security Conference, it is not a Cold War. There are many who would say that it's an imperfect analogy, but he went on to say, he said, competition must not lock out cooperation on issues that affect us all. So this notion that there has to be areas of cooperation when it comes to China. You specifically spoken to climate change is one that concerns you. Of course, you have other areas. COVID is one that President Biden has emphasized areas of cooperation. Is this one of those places that you think we ought to focus more on the competition than the cooperation? And is that balance something you worry about?
I think that the threat that China poses is so serious and so complex that it is often the desire of policymakers to sort of look away from it or not grapple with the complexity of it, because I think what I would like to hear President Biden acknowledge is that people on both sides of the aisle got China wrong for 20 years, and believed that if we encouraged them to open up economically, that they would open up politically. And instead, we saw the rise of the surveillance state, and the Chinese Communist Party has absolutely no desire or inclination or willingness to allow any sort of political openness or responsible participation in world affairs. And I think that COVID should have, sort of pulled away the misguided views that anybody had that they were going to be a responsible player on the world stage. They have got very clear designs on global domination, and in their view, that requires that the United States be defeated. So I think we have an obligation to look back and to understand and recognize what went wrong with our policies previously, and to understand we've got to work with allies to directly confront the threat that China poses. Each and every day, the Chinese Communist Party across multiple domains is attacking the United States, attacking American citizens, stealing data, attempting to, and we know that they have engaged in, all sorts of attacks in cyberspace, attempting to and effectively militarizing space, making very clear strides with respect to hypersonic weapons and other weapon systems. It is a very dangerous set of circumstances. And, the rhetoric about we need to cooperate and compete, I want to see what's behind that. I did not, if you look during the campaign at what then Vice President Biden said about China, he did not seem to have a very clear understanding of the nature of the threat or the gravity of the threat. And I would hope now that he has got access to the intelligence briefings and is spending more time focused on it, he might come to understand that. But it's a very serious threat. They're not an ally, certainly.
So you've emphasized a couple of features of the previous administration's national security strategy and national defense strategy, specifically the role of allies, also nuclear weapons. That was in your remarks. You just hit on it as well. Let's start with the allies piece. And Wyoming, I know there's a lot of energy focus and consideration. You hit on the executive orders that concern you. The Keystone cancellation, you've been critical of that, not only for parochial Wyoming concerns, or energy policy, but also for the impact on alliances and Canada. Take us through that kind of line of argument, because perhaps it's not intuitive for everybody that is actually something that our ally Canada cares deeply about and is relevant in this geopolitical consideration.
It's very important. And I think if you look at all of the executive orders on energy policy that we've seen from the Biden administration, they've been damaging. And in some instances, because of the impact that they have on jobs and on our local communities, and for us in Wyoming, it's particularly the leasing on federal lands, they are in some ways heartless. If you look at the cancellation of the Keystone Pipeline and the jobs lost because of that cancellation, and the impact, the benefit of the cancellation, I'm not sure exactly what the administration thought that they would achieve through that cancellation. It does not have any benefit in terms of actually, moving fossil fuels. And I think that as you point out, the challenge that we face now because of the commitments that have been made to Canada, they're very real ones. I would also point out that, if you look at the development of fossil fuels, whether you're talking about coal, oil, natural gas, we have the cleanest burning coal in the world. We produce the cleanest burning coal in the world. Things like directional drilling for oil development. There are technologies that we've been able to develop across the board in terms of clean coal technologies, carbon capture technologies, directional drilling and fracking, which have allowed us to become energy independent and also have allowed us to make great strides in terms of clean energy. And I think that part of what's been lost here is there's a huge focus on let's check all the boxes on Green New Deal elements. People are failing to understand and recognize that we actually know how much we need to depend upon our fossil fuels because they are reliable, because they are affordable baseload power. When you are dealing with frozen wind turbines in Texas, for example, that certainly brings the point home. But we know how to access our fossil fuels, how to develop them, in ways that involve responsible stewardship of the environment. And those are the things that reality, not to mention the resources that a state like mine needs from those leases on federal lands, that funds our schools. And it's really the ramifications of these policies are negative across the board, from economic, employment, national security. They're really misguided, and we will fight against them vigorously, and I would hope the administration would reconsider.
You're talking about some state needs, and makes me think of the COVID relief package making its way through the Congress. You emphasized in your remarks the importance of national defense, the measure of a nation's commitment to freedom, to its sovereignty, really is its investment in defense. You've said that and advocate for that in your entire time in the Congress. Take us through how a $1.9 trillion COVID bill, that's what's pending before the Congress, if adopted, it would be a total of about $3 trillion to COVID relief, actually impacts the full kind of budget discussion that you and other members of Congress will address when the normal budget, the discretionary budget, comes to the Congress later this year.
Well, it's an important point, Roger. I would say, first of all, this $1.9 trillion package is really it's going to be harmful. It's going to be harmful because of the potential impact overall on fiscal stability. It isn't targeted on people who have the greatest need. It's not temporary. It's not focused on COVID relief. As you pointed out, it includes a tremendous number of Democratic long-term policy priorities that will make it harder, not easier, for us to recover from the economic challenge we're facing. And it's really too bad, because there are a number of areas where we would have bipartisan agreement. I think the PPP program has been tremendously successful, and people support that across the board. Additional resources for vaccine distribution is another area where I think you could have had bipartisan agreement. There were good efforts underway by the Problem Solvers Caucus in the House and others to say, let's find some things that we know we need, not to mention the fact that we have $1 trillion from the previous package that we haven't spent yet. And let's focus on how do we make sure that people get the relief they need, but not take us down the path of doing significant damage to our long-term debt and to potentially the potential negative inflationary consequences of the size of this package. And so overall, it's a package that is irresponsible and could have been bipartisan. And I'm sorry that the Democrats chose not to do that. In terms of spending, you're exactly right. We're going to come back around again, and we see even more downward pressure on the budget overall because of COVID. There's certainly been significant costs as a result of COVID that the Department of Defense has absorbed. And when we begin having the negotiations over what our spending is going to look like for the next couple of years, I would anticipate that the Democrats may well just try to pretend this $1.9 trillion package didn't happen. And once again, look at the defense budget as a way to deal with the debt. And I always, hearken back to Senator Mike Enzi when before he retired.
Former Senator Wyoming.
Right, exactly. Who, talked about the percentage of the budget every year that Congress is really arguing about and debating about. It's, 26%, maybe 27%. And so the idea that you're going to really be able to effectively address the debt by cutting into the defense budget, is dangerous. And I'm sure that debate will come up again. And I'm sure that it'll be coupled with demands for increased domestic spending, not based on need, but based on sort of this dollar for dollar formula that the Budget Control Act has required of us.
We only have a few minutes left. I'm going to go to one question from the audience, and then if I want to get to actually focus on items other than China. So this comes from a general audience question. Asked, with so much partisanship between and decisiveness within the Republican Democrats, what are the common policies that give America a united approach to foreign policy? And then it questions whether U.S. and China actually offers a real bipartisan issue right now.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think before COVID, you certainly did have bipartisan agreement growing in the House, and I would imagine in the Senate as well, about the threat that China poses. Unfortunately, I think what happened over the course of the last year, and the China Task Force is a perfect example of this, where we really tried to work with the Democrats, tried to work with Speaker Pelosi to make this a bipartisan task force, and ultimately she wouldn't do that. But any of these national security issues, as well as COVID, ultimately the solutions have got to be bipartisan solutions. The debt is a perfect example of that. Ultimately, if we are going to do what is necessary and responsible and address the debt, we've got to be willing to do it on a bipartisan basis. And so I think, as I said, we've got some really good groups in the House. The Problem Solvers Caucus is one of them. It gets 28 Republicans and 28 Democrats that work on these issues. And I think an understanding and a recognition, we've got to find ways to try to put aside some of the vitriol and work for bipartisan solutions where those are available.
All right, a couple last questions, then we'll have to wrap up. For about 12 years, we've had presidents argue against so-called endless wars, forever wars. President Obama advocated ending wars abroad and rebuilding at home. President Trump had his own version with the endless wars. Right now, we had President Biden recently say with respect to Afghanistan that we remain committed to ensuring that Afghanistan never again provides a base for terrorist attacks against the United States and our partners and our interests. Yet there are reports that the administration, the Biden administration that is weighing the Afghanistan policy and perhaps not maintaining the true presence that you in your remarks argued is essential. Where do you think we're going to land, and what can be done? You hit on Afghanistan, Iraq, and I guess Syria all get thrown into this language of endless or forever wars.
Yeah, I think that it is irresponsible to use phrases like endless war. That is not a description that is accurate about what's happening in a place like Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria. And I think that we have to take responsibility for being honest with the American people about what is happening. And that is that in order for us to be able to defend ourselves, in order for us to be able to ensure that terrorists can't establish safe havens from which they could attack us again, we've got to have sufficient resources, whether it's for the counterintelligence mission, in some cases a counterterrorism mission, sufficient resources to work with local entities and be able to deny safe havens to terrorists. So if we get to a place where the commanders on the ground say that we can reduce our troop levels, or the conditions on the ground suggest that we could, then I think that those are decisions that have got to be made based on those kinds of criteria. I think that in Afghanistan, the notion, and I've been publicly opposed to this idea that there's a negotiated peace that we can reach with the Taliban. That's just simply not the case. The idea that we would base any of our deployment decisions on purported words from members of the Taliban is highly irresponsible. And again, we have to make the decision: does our security require, does our ability to prevent the spread of Al-Qaeda or ISIS or other terrorist organizations, does that require us to have troops deployed? If our security requires it, we need to do it. And acting as though we're going to have a negotiated settlement in Afghanistan with Taliban is just simply, it's not the case, and it's playing games with American security we shouldn't be playing.
Congresswoman Liz Cheney, we'll have to leave it there. So much more I'd love to get into, but we'll have to wait for another time. Thank you so much for joining us once again at the Reagan Institute.
Thank you, Roger. Always great to be with you all. Take care.